The settlement sheet came out of the printer the way those things always did, curled at one corner, smelling faintly of toner, not particularly dramatic to look at. Roy Fulton took it from the elevator clerk without being asked and read the number at the bottom twice. He read it the way a man reads a number he cannot immediately fit into his existing understanding of the world, slowly, and then again more slowly. Wade Mercer stood at the counter with his cap in one hand and his grain ticket in the other. He was 61 years old that November. His coat was a canvas barn jacket that had been washed so many times the elbows had faded to the color of old straw, and the canvas at the shoulders had gone soft enough to feel like a flannel through a glove. The cap was a Pioneer Seed corn cap from 1996, the fabric of the panel above the brim shaped to his forehead from 20 winters and 20 summers of being put on and taken off in the same one-handed motion. He did not reach for the settlement sheet. He already knew what it said. Roy set the paper down on the counter between them and did not say anything for a long moment. The clerk found something to do at the far end of the counter. Outside in the parking lot, Wade's border collie Stitch sat in the passenger seat of the old pickup and watched the door with the patient attention that only a working dog and a paid-off farmer share. $187,000, cash grain settlement for the 2014 crop year. 280 acres of corn and soybeans, no lien holder on the check, no note to service that evening when Wade got home and opened the mail, just the number. Roy finally said, "Huh." That was all he said. And Wade put his cap back on, folded his copy of the ticket into his breast pocket, and walked out to where Stitch was waiting. Let me tell you how a man arrives at a moment like that one, because the number on the settlement sheet did not come from a good year alone. It came from 28 years of a decision most people in Garrett County would have called foolish, and one man in particular had called considerably worse than that. Wade had grown up on his father's 280 acres outside the town of Linwood, Indiana, which sat far enough from the interstate that the county road leading to it still had grass growing down the center stripe in dry summers. His father, Earl Mercer, had farmed those acres with an older tractor and an older philosophy, and when Earl died in 1984, he left the land to Wade with a single instruction, delivered 3 days before the end: do not owe more than you can pay in a bad year. That was not a complicated instruction. It was, in the context of Indiana farming in the 1980s, a nearly radical one. Wade had watched the decade take farms the way a river takes a field in flood season, quietly at first and then all at once. 2 neighbors to the north had borrowed against expansion in 1979 and 1980, bought ground at $1,100 and $1,200 an acre, watched that ground drop to $400 by 1985, and lost it to the bank before Wade was 30. He had stood at one of those foreclosure auctions in the spring of 1986 and felt something settle in him, cold and permanent. The Hendersons' equipment going out in the mud while the family watched from the fence line. The Hendersons' tractor, which Earl had helped Harold Henderson pick out, rolling away on someone else's flatbed. He drove home that afternoon and found Cora at the kitchen table. She had her father's ledger open in front of her, which was something she did when she was working through a question she could not otherwise resolve. Her father, Gerald Holt, had farmed 60 acres in Decatur County and had once carried a note through 4 consecutive dry years by knowing exactly where every dollar was on every day of every month. The ledger was a cloth-covered composition book, the pages brown at the edges, the columns penciled in her father's small, careful hand. Cora had kept it since Gerald died in 1981, and she referred to it the way some people refer to a letter from someone they trusted completely. Wade told her what he had seen at the auction. She listened without looking up from the ledger. When he finished, she said, "Your father said the same thing after the Winslow place went in '69. Wade said, "Oh, I know." "So we know what the answer is," she said. He did. He just needed to find the equipment to go with it. The answer arrived in September of 1987 at a farm auction outside Rushville, Indiana, 22 miles from the Mercer place. The auction was a 2-day affair that drew buyers from 4 counties because the estate was substantial, and the family had decided to liquidate completely. There were 3 tractors, a combine, a grain cart, a disc, a field cultivator, and among the smaller items, a 1979 4-row planter that had spent most of its life in a dry shed and showed it. The paint was faded to a dusty orange, but the row units were tight, and the seed tubes were clean, and the cast iron frame was solid as a church pew. The family had kept it serviced. You could tell by the grease fittings, all of them clean and recent. Wade walked the planter twice before the bidding opened. He checked the depth-gauging wheels, tested the finger pickups, ran his thumb along the seed tubes. He looked at the cast-iron toolbar for cracks at the welds and found none. He bent and looked under the row units at the parallel linkage and found the bushings tight. He spun a depth wheel by hand and listened for play in the bearing and found none. He had a list of what he needed and a number in his head, and the number was what he could pay without borrowing. $2,500, not a dollar more. The bidding opened at $800. It stalled at $1,900. A man from the back raised it to $2,000, and Wade raised it to $2,200, and nobody moved after that. $2,200 cash. The planter was his. Roy Fulton was at the same auction because Roy Fulton was at every auction in 4 counties and considered himself an authority on equipment. Roy ran Fulton Farm Supply on the edge of Linwood, sold new equipment on consignment for 2 manufacturers, and had opinions about everything mechanical the way some men have opinions about weather. He was standing with a group of farmers near the equipment line when Wade drove the planter out on his borrowed trailer, and he said, loud enough for the group to hear, "Well, Mercer finally got himself some equipment. Bought a relic." A couple of the men laughed. Roy was likable, generous with his time, and usually right about equipment in the short term, which gave his opinions a weight they did not always deserve over longer distances. Wade heard him. He lifted one hand in a neighborly wave, loaded the planter, and drove home. Cora helped him unload it that evening. They set it in the machine shed beside the tractor, and she walked around it the same way Wade had at the auction, checking the same things. She knelt at the second row unit and looked at the parallel linkage from below the way her father had taught her to look at planter linkage in 1968. She straightened up and brushed dust off the knees of her trousers. When she came around the front, she said, "It's straight." "It's straight," Wade agreed. "And it's paid for," she said. "That too," he said. He spent the winter taking the planter apart section by section and putting it back together. The shed was unheated, and his hands ached at the knuckles by the second hour most mornings, and he kept a small kerosene heater on a shop stand in the corner where he was working. And Cora brought coffee out at 10 in a thermos with 2 cups so they could share one when she came. He wrote down everything he found in a school notebook. Which springs had been replaced, which hadn't, the condition of each seed plate, the adjustment range of each row unit. He noted the part number of each replacement bushing, the supplier, the price, and the date he had set it back into the unit. By spring, the notebook had 11 pages of notes in Wade's cramped handwriting, and the planter was as close to factory new as a careful man could bring a machine to without a factory. He planted his first 280-acre crop with it in May of 1988. Corn on the north fields, beans on the south, the same rotation his father had run for 20 years. The planter worked. Of course it worked. It was a machine built when manufacturers still used cast iron on the parts that mattered, and it had been maintained by a family that understood that keeping something running is cheaper than buying something new. Wade planted with it in 1988, 1989, and 1990, and he kept his winter notebook going, adding pages each December when he pulled the planter in and went over it row by row. Roy upgraded in 1990. He bought a 6-row planter on a 4-year note and told people at the elevator that 4 rows was no way to run a modern operation. He was not wrong exactly. 6 rows planted faster than 4. Roy's tractor was newer, his combine was newer, his disc was newer, and he farmed 160 acres of his own and rented another 60 on top of that. On paper, Roy's operation looked considerably more prosperous than Wade's. Roy said as much one Saturday morning in the spring of 1991 at the co-op in Linwood, where half a dozen farmers gathered most Saturdays around a coffee machine that had been there since the Carter administration. He said, loud enough for the room, that a man farming in the 90s with a 4-row planter was farming in the 70s, and that the Mercer place was going to fall behind the county average on yield and stay there. Wade was not at the co-op that morning. He was in his machine shed putting new seed plates in the planter. Cora heard about it from the feed store clerk 2 days later and told Wade at supper. Wade said, "Roy's probably right about the yield." He ate his soup. "Roy's definitely right about the speed." "He didn't mention the note," Cora said. "He never does," Wade said. Here is what most people watching Roy's operation in the early 1990s would have said was happening. They would have said a modern farmer was running a well-capitalized operation, and a stubborn, old-fashioned farmer was running a small one. They would have been accurate about the equipment and wrong about everything underneath it. Roy upgraded again in 1995. New 6-row corn planter with in-furrow fertilizer, purchased on a 3-year note at a dealer in Columbus. He told the Saturday Co-op group that the new unit would pay for itself in the yield improvement inside 2 years, and the agronomist from the seed company who visited the co-op that February had agreed with him. Wade was there that morning and heard the agronomist's presentation on the new seed technology. He bought the seed. He passed on the planter. If you enjoy stories about the quiet people who turn out to have been right the whole time, go ahead and subscribe. There are a lot more of them. Roy made his case directly to Wade in the parking lot afterward. He said, "Mom, Wade, I'm going to be straight with you. That old equipment is costing you money you don't think you're spending. You're losing yield, and you're losing time, and you're losing the chance to scale up." He said it the way a man says something he genuinely believes, which Roy did. He was not trying to sell Wade anything that morning. He was trying to help. Wade said, "I appreciate that, Roy." He drove home. The 1995 note on Roy's new planter was $64,000 over 48 months, which worked out to roughly $1,400 a month. Wade's planter that year cost him about $320 in parts and 4 days of his own labor during the winter service. When you subtracted the note from Roy's operation and added nothing to Wade's, the gap between their actual positions was already wider than it looked from the road. Wade carried his last farm note into the mid-90s, a land note from his father's estate that he serviced carefully and retired in 2001. He planted every spring from 1988 through 2001 with the same planter, updating the school notebook every winter, ordering parts from a supplier in Kentucky who still stocked the original components. He switched to a second notebook in 1997 when the first one filled up. The 1894 co-op dismissal is the one worth naming specifically because it was the loudest, the most witnessed, and the one Wade never entirely forgot. It was a late March morning, mud season, the kind of day when half the county was in town because the fields were too wet to work. The co-op was crowded. Roy was there with two men from the next township over who Wade did not know well, and Roy had been talking about a new piece of equipment he was evaluating, a precision planter with electronic row clutches that had just been demonstrated at the farm show in Indianapolis. He looked up when Wade came in the door and said, "Here he is. I was just telling these fellows about the state of the art in planting technology." He paused. "And here's the state of 1979. The men laughed. Roy grinned. He said, "Mercer, I'll make you a deal. You sell me that antique for parts, and I'll sell you something with this century's row population on it." Someone said, "What do you even get for a planter that old, Roy?" Roy said, "About what you'd get for a good dog. Not much, but more than it's worth." Wade stood there a moment. He got himself a cup of coffee. He said evenly, "I'll let you know if I decide to sell." He walked to the far end of the counter where the seed catalogs were stacked and started looking through one. The room moved on. That was the thing about Wade. He never gave a dismissal anywhere to go. But Cora heard about it that afternoon from the clerk at the feed store. Same as always, and that evening she wrote the date and Roy's exact words in the margin of her father's ledger. Not out of spite. She was a bookkeeper by temperament, and she believed the record should be complete. Roy upgraded a third time in 1999. He bought a new planter, a new tractor to pull it, and a newer combine, all on separate notes, and the total equipment debt he was carrying by the end of that year had climbed to something in the neighborhood of $280,000. He was servicing those notes from a combination of crop income, cash rent from land he owned, and a line of credit at the local bank. His yields were good. The 1990s were decent years for Indiana grain, and Roy's operation looked strong by every visible measure. Wade paid off his last note in June of 2001. He did not make a ceremony of it. He told Cora when the bank confirmation came, and she found the page in the ledger where the note had first been entered, and put a single line through the balance column and wrote the date beside it. Then she closed the ledger and went to start supper, and Wade went out to the machine shed to check the planter's disc openers, which had been showing some wear and needed attention before spring. Stitch followed him out. The dog was 2 years old that summer, a black and white border collie who had been given to Wade by a neighbor whose litter had outgrown the yard. Stitch had decided within his first week that wherever Wade went was where he was supposed to be, and he had maintained that position with the kind of consistency you only see in dogs and men who have found their purpose. The years between 2001 and 2008 were the steadiest of Wade's farming life. The land note was gone, the equipment note had never existed, and the planter ran every spring on its maintenance schedule and its winter notebook, which was now into its 4th volume. Wade planted 280 acres of corn and soybeans in the same rotation his father had kept his yields within the county average, and put money into a savings account and 2 certificates of deposit at the Linwood State Bank every fall when the settlement checks cleared. Roy, in those same years, was managing a substantial equipment portfolio in the way that a man manages substantial equipment debt, which means carefully and with one eye always on interest rates. His operation was productive. His equipment was current. His debt was, by 2007, $340,000, spread across 3 notes and a line of credit, with a weighted average interest rate around 6.5%. The credit markets tightened in 2008 and stayed tight for 4 years. which most people remember as a housing crisis and not as a farm credit story. But the tightening ran through agricultural lending the same way it ran through everything else. Interest rates on Roy's line of credit adjusted upward. The grain market spiked in 2008, which helped, but came back down in 2009 and stayed erratic. Roy refinanced his largest note in 2009 at a higher rate than he had expected, and he refinanced again in 2011. The second refinancing came with terms that required Roy to reduce his total debt profile. He sold his combine in the winter of 2011 and bought a used one from a dealer in Muncie, replacing a debt of roughly $90,000 with a debt of $30,000. He sold 80 acres of his own ground in December of that year to a cash buyer from Central Illinois. The buyer was a farm management company that was quietly assembling acreage in the region. The 80 acres went for $840 per acre, which was below the county average for the year. Roy needed the transaction to close before the 1st of January, and the buyer knew it. The man who had rented those 80 acres from Roy was a young farmer named Caleb Drum, 27 years old, who had been working ground in Garrett County for 4 years on cash leases, most of it rented from older operators who liked him because he was punctual with his rent and careful with the land. Caleb lost the lease on Roy's 80 acres when the land sold, because the Illinois company had its own tenant network. He drove out to see Wade that January to ask if he knew of anything available in the area. Wade had him come in. Cora made coffee. Wade asked him about his equipment, his rotation plan, his soil testing habits. Caleb had questions about the ground and answered Wade's questions without hesitation. He was not the kind of young man who oversells himself. Wade noticed that. He did not have anything to offer Caleb that January. He told him so. He said, "You keep doing what you're doing and check back in a couple of years." Caleb thanked him and left. Stitch watched the truck go from the porch. Roy's newest planter, which he had purchased in the spring of 2012 after selling the old one as part of his debt restructuring, developed a hydraulic failure in the spring of 2013. The failure was in the central hydraulic manifold, a component that controlled the downforce system on the newer electronic row units, and the repair estimate from the dealer in Columbus came in at $14,200. Roy did not have that $14,000 liquid in April of 2013. The repair went on his line of credit. Wade planted his 2013 crop in May with a 1979 planter, which was then 34 years old and in its 27th consecutive year of service on the Mercer ground. The row units were on their third set of fingers, the seed tubes had been replaced twice, and the cast iron frame showed no more than the surface rust that any iron will accumulate in 27 Indiana winters. The paint was a soft, uneven orange now, the kind of orange that came of weather and sun and the particular fade of the John Deere green or any other manufacturer's tractor color when the equipment had spent enough seasons working under sky. The hitch pin was the same hitch pin he had cleaned and re-greased every winter since 1989. The seed boxes had a small, near-invisible repair at the lid hinge, where Wade had run a piece of wire through a bent pivot in the spring of 1996. It went into the field and did what it had always done. When Roy's planter came back from Columbus with its new manifold in late May of 2013, the planting window was narrower than ideal. Roy got his corn in, but the northern 30 acres went in late, and the yield data that fall showed it. The 2014 crop year was a strong one for central Indiana corn and soybeans, driven by favorable weather through pollination and strong basis at most elevators. Wade's 280 acres came in at 198 bushels per acre on the corn ground and 52 on the bean ground, both numbers within 2% of his 10-year average. He ran the planter through those fields that spring without a breakdown, without a hydraulic failure, without a single service call to anyone except the parts supplier in Kentucky for a pair of seed disc replacements that cost him $67, including shipping. His settlement check for the 2014 crop year, drawn on the Linwood Elevator account and presented to him in November of 2015 after final settlement and storage fees, came to $187,000. Roy was at the elevator that same day, settling his own year. He did not know Wade would be there. He picked up the settlement sheet from the counter because it was the nearest piece of paper, and he needed something to look at while the clerk pulled up his account, and the number at the bottom of that sheet was not his number. Roy read the number twice. He looked at Wade. Wade was looking at nothing in particular, his cap in one hand, his grain ticket in the other. Roy said, "Huh." That was his recognition, not elaborate. Roy Fulton was not an elaborate man in moments of correction. He was an honest one. The number on that sheet was not the number of a man who was farming in the 70s, or farming behind, or farming with equipment that should have been sold for parts. The number on that sheet was the number of a man who had been right about something important for 28 years, and Roy understood arithmetic well enough to reach that conclusion without being guided to it. Wade folded his ticket into his breast pocket and walked to the door. He stopped with his hand on the glass and said, without turning around, "You plant anything this spring? Come by and have a look at the planter. She's still running." Roy said, "I might do that, Wade." He said it quietly, with something in his voice that he might have called respect if someone had asked him to name it. Outside, Stitch stood up on the seat and pressed his nose to the passenger window as Wade came across the lot. Wade opened the door, and the cold air of the cab came out at him. The smell of the wool blanket on the seat and the canvas of his own coat absorbed into the fabric, and the dog moved over and put his head on Wade's knee as he started the truck. Wade sat there a moment with one hand on the steering wheel and one hand on Stitch's head, looking at the elevator. $187,000. No note against it. No equipment payment coming out in December. No line of credit interest accumulating while the check cleared. He drove home through the long, flat country roads of Garrett County in the late November afternoon, the fields cut clean and the corn rows running away to the tree lines on both sides, the elevator silos visible in his rear view as low gray shapes against the lower sky. The lease arrangement with Caleb came together in the spring of 2017. Wade had been thinking about it for 2 years, since the conversation at the kitchen table in January of 2013. He had talked it over with Cora and with Dale, who farmed the southeast quarter of the property and managed the soybean rotation on a handshake arrangement with his father. Dale was 34 that year, careful with the ground the same way Wade was careful with equipment, and he had his own opinion about leasing to a neighbor who would eventually be competition for additional acreage in the area. Wade heard Dale's concern and considered it. He said, "Caleb's farming Roy's old 80 acres already, the ones that company bought. He's doing right by the ground. We lease him the South 40. And he's close enough that I can watch how he works." Dale said, "He's going to want to buy it eventually." "That's fine," Wade said. "You'd sell to him?" "First option," Wade said. "At a fair price." Wade offered Caleb 120 acres, the southern fields that adjoined the Drum family's current rentals, at $95 per acre per year. The market rate for comparable ground in Garrett County that spring was $140. Wade did not offer the below-market rate as charity, and he told Caleb so. He said, This rate is so you can build a reserve. If you can't build a reserve, you'll be where Roy was, and I don't need a neighbor who's in trouble. Caleb said he understood that. He signed the lease at $95 per acre, with a first option to purchase clause written in Cora's handwriting on a half-page attached to the back. Cora notarized it herself. She had held a notary commission for the county for 12 years. Dale watched the transaction. He did not say anything at the time. That changed in the summer of 2018, when he stood at the edge of Caleb's field and watched the young man run the 1979 planter through a cover crop termination pass, the old machine moving through the green residue the same steady way it had moved through 30 years of black Indiana soil. Dale drove back to the home place and found his father in the machine shed. He said, "That planter runs better than anything I've seen Caleb use." Wade said, "I know. How do you keep it running like that?" Wade went to the workbench and found the notebooks. 5 of them now, the first 2 worn smooth, the last 3 progressively newer. He set them in Dale's hands and said, "Start with the first one. Everything you need to know about that machine is in there." Dale stood there a moment, feeling their weight. "I should have asked sooner," he said. "You're asking now," Wade said. Wade retired from active farming in the spring of 2019. He was 65 years old, and his knees had told him the previous harvest that they would not be negotiating another season without a conversation. He signed the field operations over to Dale, who had been ready for 3 years, even if he had not said so. Caleb's lease was current, his reserve was building, and the first option clause was alive in its binder on Cora's shelf. The 1979 planter had planted its 40th crop in 2019. 40 years from its manufacture, 33 crops under Wade's hand, it was still operable. The cast iron frame had not cracked. The notebook system was intact. Dale knew the maintenance schedule the way Wade knew it, had taken it apart, and put it back together under Wade's supervision the previous winter, and could order the parts from the Kentucky supplier without consulting anyone. Roy came by the Mercer place in early June of that year. On a Tuesday evening, when the light was long and gold across the soybean fields. He had heard from someone at the elevator that Wade was stepping back, and he came by partly to say so in person, and partly because he had been meaning to for a while, and partly for a reason he did not name when he knocked. Wade brought him around to the machine shed, the way he brought anyone who came to talk farming, because the machine shed was where the conversation was real. Roy looked at the planter for a long moment. He walked around it the same way Wade had walked around it at the Rushville auction in 1987, checking the frame, touching the row units. He said, "She looked like this when you bought her?" "Better," Wade said. "I put work in." Roy nodded. He ran one hand along the cast iron toolbar and said, "I've bought and sold 6 planters since you bought this one." "I know," Wade said. Roy said, "You were right about the notes." He said it straight, without a preamble, the way an honest man says a thing that has been true for long enough that saying it doesn't cost anything anymore. Wade said, "You built a good operation, Roy. You built it by different arithmetic." Roy said, "My arithmetic put 80 acres in Illinois." Wade said, "Well." He turned back to the workbench and set down the wrench he had been carrying. "Dale's taking over the ground. Caleb's got the south lease. It's in good hands." Roy asked about the planter, whether Dale would keep using it. Wade said, "Long as it runs." Roy looked at it again. He said slowly, with a kind of admiration that came out reluctantly, the way it does in men who have taken a long time to update their opinions, things 40 years old. 40 years and paid for, Wade said. They talked for another half hour about the county and the Drum family, and the new seed varieties coming out of Purdue. Roy left before supper. When his truck pulled out of the drive, Stitch came around the corner of the shed and sat beside Wade and watched the taillights go. The evening was warm and still, and the fields to the south were the color of new money. The summer after Wade retired, Cora organized the 5 planter notebooks into a single folder and placed them on the workbench shelf where they had always lived in order, first volume to last. They had the quality of a record that had never been meant for anyone but the machine and the man. And now they were something Dale would read before every winter service, and something Caleb would eventually read when the ground became his. The farm itself, all 280 acres, continued under Dale's management, and the South Fields continued under Caleb's lease at $95 per acre. The first option, clause patient in its binder. Caleb was farming well and saving consistently, and the arithmetic of his reserve was moving in the right direction. He had asked Wade twice in the past year about the clause and its terms, and both times Wade had said the same thing. The price will be fair, and the first right is yours. Dale had taken the notebook seriously. He had the planter apart and back together in the first winter, checking off the same items Wade had checked for 33 years, and when he put the machine back in its place in February of 2020, he told his father it was better than he expected. Wade said, "Now you know why." He was sitting on an overturned milk crate near the shed door, watching Dale work. Stitch was asleep near the door, chin on his paws, one ear up. The wind was coming from the northwest, and the fields were cold and bare. Wade had been carrying his father's instruction for 36 years. Do not owe more than you can pay in a bad year. He had kept that instruction the way he kept the planter, not perfectly, not without doubt, but consistently and on schedule. In 2001, when the last note went to zero, he had felt something release in him that he had not known was held, a kind of low, chronic tension that had been present so long he had stopped noticing it. In 2015, when Roy read the settlement sheet and said nothing for a full breath, Wade had felt something entirely different, something quieter and older than satisfaction. Something that felt like his father's instruction being confirmed not by argument but by outcome. He thought about Harold Henderson's tractor rolling away on that flatbed in the spring of 1986. He thought about Cora's father's ledger, the penciled columns, the foreclosure paid off slowly. He thought about $2,200 cash at a Rushville auction and a planter that had outlasted 6 of Roy's. He did not think of himself as a man who had won anything. He thought of himself as a man who had kept his word to a piece of ground and a notebook and a principle, and the ground had kept its word back. Patience is not a strategy. It is a daily decision, made again every winter at a workbench, and every spring at a planting depth, and every fall when the elevator prints the number on the sheet. Dale finished reassembling the last row unit and stood up and stretched his back. The work light over the bench threw a flat yellow on the planter and on the cast-iron toolbar and on the small, careful pile of bolts and bushings he had set on the workbench in the order he had taken them off. The smell in the shed was the smell that had lived in the shed every February for 40 years, the cold of the concrete floor, the faint kerosene of the heater, the chain and gear oil that had been worked into the planter's joints across 33 winters of service. He looked at the planter and then at his father. "Same as last year?" he said. "Same as last year," Wade said. "Same as at the year before that." Dale nodded and closed the notebook. He set it back on the shelf in its order, 5th volume to the right of the 4th, and turned off the work light. The shed went dim and then dark, and the cold concrete under their boots took back the small heat the kerosene had left, and they walked out together into the cold February evening, the breath coming out of them in thin clouds in the yard light, the planter behind them in its long shape, under the sheet Cora had cut and hemmed for it in 1992. The machine sat in the dark the way it had sat through 40 winters, waiting on spring.